Coral reef is your asset, and it's something that we absolutely need to keep promoting. So a lot of the work that I'm trying to do and trying to promote within my own community is to really enhance what we're all calling the ocean literacy, making sure that the financial sector is becoming more ocean literate by understanding these different kinds of dependencies. But of course, I would also love to see many of these companies, these sectors, scaling and becoming more institutionally accessible. My name is Bowie-MacDonald. As I said, I've specialized in working in the asset management industry for about 13 or 14 years now. One of the big trends that I've seen in my career is really the adoption of thinking about ESG principles and really a strong interest in sustainable investing. And so looking at my day-to-day job, it's not really directly focused on the blue economy because it has a relatively small investment universe. There's not that many companies that are listed that we would think of as like pure blue. But there are lots of sectors, of course, that are linked to it. So anything relating to tourism, shipping, of course. We might even want to look a little bit further afield and think about aviation. You know, if, for example, a coral reef were to die and that was a major source of tourist income and people stopped coming, that would obviously start to impact things like aviation because people would no longer be flying there. People would no longer be eating in the local restaurants. They would no longer be staying in the local hotels. So there's a lot of dependencies in sectors that we are directly involved in, that we do invest in, but they're not necessarily what we would think of as blue sectors in the traditional sense or in the pure sense, because a lot of the time, a lot of these structural barriers are preventing them from being able to access finance. Encouraging and finding different innovative ways to make it investable for the financial markets, if indeed the people working in that space are requiring capital. I think a lot of the time that's going to require them to think much more entrepreneurially than they perhaps have historically. And one of the ways that you could do this, and there's lots of ways, and there's no miracle cures for these things, but to start thinking about the value chain. So perhaps we could use something like seaweed as an example. It might be relatively intuitive to this community to want to grow seaweed, but it's less intuitive to them to process it and then to sell it, find the distribution markets. But by building business models where you're basically enhancing your overall value chain, it suddenly becomes a more viable business for the financial community to be able to invest into, because it suddenly has scale. Suddenly you're starting to access the higher margin parts of the overall process that you're developing. So I would really encourage the community to start trying to think even more entrepreneurially than they have, particularly when it comes to things like thinking about the value chain of what they're doing.
So how do you get communities to do more of that? You said ocean literacy, but what does that mean in practice? How do you trickle that down?
Well, one of the things that we're trying to do through the work that I do with UNESCO is to try to find examples where people are doing it already. If there's one thing that we can say for sure, is that there are many very entrepreneurial, very innovative people in this space. But what we're not necessarily doing as well is identifying those people and amplifying those stories, developing case studies and showing people with examples of how other people have done it. There's lots of incredibly entrepreneurial people all over the world, but that information is not being shared and accessed to inspire people in other communities and other places to replicate those models. And I think we can all do a lot more work on that front. Well, you can obviously define ocean literacy in many different ways. The way that I've tried to define ocean literacy is to really think about it's really about understanding our relationship with the ocean and the ocean's relationship with us, really at the highest level. But of course, there's a hierarchy of different definitions that you could use. I come from the finance sector, so the thing that's been enlightening for me is to understand that many of the sectors that we do invest in, that we are interacting with, where we are speaking to the business leaders in those sectors, have lots of dependencies in their business model relating to the ocean that are not visible. They're not particularly well understood. One example, but there are many, could be it's very common that the financial sector will interact with the pharmaceutical industry. But how many people are aware that during the COVID era, some of the vaccines were dependent on some compounds coming from the sea, specifically sharks? So there's a very interesting example of trying to better understand those dependencies and how they are actually interacting with sectors that we do deal with every single day. Because I think there is a tendency for people to look at the blue economy and view it as this exceptionally niche thing. And that's not wrong. It is niche in many respects. If you're trying to approach this as a pure play, are there a large number of companies that are, strictly speaking, focused on the blue economy? There aren't that many, but of course it's growing. But there are many, many very big sectors that are dependent on the ocean. And I think trying to raise awareness around that is very, very important. I think the moment for me where things really began to drop, or the penny dropped, was as I was starting to look through the literature and identifying these dependencies. When you start looking at some of the environmental metrics of what's happening in our oceans, the damage that's being done, the overall trend is exceptionally negative. I think my community, and indeed the more environmental community, are deeply, deeply uncomfortable with the idea of putting a price on anything relating to the ocean. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. It feels like you're trying to commodify something sacred. But whether we like it or not, numbers are the language of investment decision making. They're the language of finance. And if we're not willing to make an attempt, despite all of the imperfections, to try to put an economic value on something, it becomes very, very difficult for the finance community to be able to interact with it. So for me, to answer your question directly, I think where things really began to become exciting and for me to realize just how important the work that I was doing, and of course many, many other people are doing, was as more and more data is becoming available, as a better understanding of these dependencies are taking place, that just how critical the work is that we're doing, and that even the space that I work in, which is asset management, predominantly investing in the public markets, that actually this is a topic that we should be paying very close attention to. It's very, very critical.
Good. But then circling again back to my question, you have a very concrete example in mind where you could say, hey, this community understood this relationship and thereby created this opportunity, this business case, collected, scaled?
No, honestly, not exactly. And I think part of the problem is the financial community is often quite distant from these grassroots examples. We're operating at a space that's far removed from local communities a lot of the time. It's very distant. So to give you an example of the way that generally speaking, the investment community tends to think about that type of thing, is we will of course be looking at corporations. We are interacting with the people that are working within those corporations. We're looking at the products and services that they are building and selling. We are then thinking about the people that work for them, so that the S part of ESG, for example, looking at the way they treat their employees, looking at the way that they treat their supply chains, but it's relatively far removed from what we tend to do day to day. So it's quite difficult actually for much of the financial community, if they're only working in the financial community, to really have that visceral sense of what's happening at the grassroots level. But of course, some of the additional work that I'm doing beyond that through UNESCO has exposed me to some of these issues, and it's felt much more real, more tangible, more physical. And for me, that's been an exceptionally rewarding experience. And sorry, just to add, many other people who work in finance are also doing similar type of work, working for NGOs, and they're actively involved in all sorts of other initiatives, which does give them that real, tangible, real-world experience. And they bring that passion and that knowledge and that expertise back into the industry, which is really invaluable. But for me personally, I think the tangible examples where I've been really, really proud is where we've been able to try and support various different initiatives, and then we've been able to really see the impact in those local communities. And a lot of that work was actually done in my previous employer through the charitable foundation that we had, where we were supporting a lot of water and ocean related projects over a number of years. And that was an exceptionally rewarding thing to see. And it's something that we don't tend to see in the financial community because we're operating at the corporate level, not necessarily at the grassroots level.
So how do you connect the high-level financial sector with local communities better? What's the systemic change that's needed?
Well, I think that systemic change is happening. Now, progress, if we define it as progress, is rarely linear. The pathway to where we want to go is almost never a straight line. I think we're going through a phase where we're starting to see some challenges in that particular space, driven by political shifts that are taking place globally. Perhaps some of the over-exuberance that we saw in sustainable investing or ESG in general within the financial community. But what I hope and what I believe to be the case is that whilst things may have got a little bit too exuberant, to repeat that term again, I think that we are going through a phase where there's the entire sector has got a much deeper understanding of what works, what doesn't work, what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing, what we should be saying and what we shouldn't be saying. So the level of knowledge and understanding within the financial community of sustainable investing has really, really expanded very dramatically. And I think that's a really good thing. I think the next phase, the next evolution that we go through in this space will be far better than the first one. But I think we have to not be too critical of some of the mistakes that I think the industry have made. I mean, there were, of course, some bad actors, as there are in any area. But the overwhelming majority of people that I have worked with, in fact, I would go as far as to say I think everybody I have interacted with in my community, the finance sector, was very well-meaning. But But I think it's needed time with changing regulations and emerging data and trying to work out how to use it, and very complicated client expectations, and trying to navigate this very complicated space has definitely not been easy. And I've been in that space. I know how complicated it's been, and I would consider myself to be very well intentioned. But how, to answer your question very directly, how does the finance community better connect with, for example, local communities? I think that will always remain a challenge given the way that the finance sector is structured. There are parts of the finance community, whether it be through development banks or perhaps moving into some of the VC space or the private equity space, where they are more directly connected to the businesses that they're exposed to. But I think for much of the financial markets, that will remain a challenge for structural reasons. But of course, they can and do get involved in local initiatives and sponsoring community projects and lots of other things, often through things like their charitable giving, their charitable foundations, things of that nature. It is definitely a road. I think we should always expect, whenever you do anything new, that it will be a bumpy road. I think to some degree we've got to embrace it. I think the checks and balances, the critiques are essential. It keeps us all in check, not just as individuals, but all of us and all of our different communities and sectors that we work in. I think it's an evolution that we're going through, but I think it's a positive one. I think the overall trend is positive.
Anything else you'd like? Well, okay. Message to the government, message to governments, and then message to youth.
Message to governments. What would be the most important thing to say to a government right now? I think my message to governments would be to acknowledge that this community is growing, and it's growing very fast. It's becoming increasingly apparent to many different actors just how critical better understanding our relationship with water and the ocean is to not only to life on Earth, but to many, from an economic perspective, to many of the sectors that we're invested in. And if you're a government, that you're responsible for. You're responsible for your people, you're responsible for your local economies, you have a responsibility. And I think really doing whatever you can to encourage children, corporations, all different actors within your society to better understand what's happening in our oceans and what's happening with water, and to understand these dependencies will only be a positive. We've had a really wonderful example just recently where the Brazilian government have committed to integrating the blue curriculum into all schools across Brazil. This is an exceptionally powerful thing, and it doesn't cost very much money. You're just adding something, a topic of critical importance to a national curriculum to create an entire generation of people who will become much more aware of their relationship with the ocean. We can't even begin to imagine the consequences of that, the positive consequences of that in the coming generations. So I would really encourage governments to look at wonderful examples like Brazil and other countries and try to do what they can to replicate it and perhaps even improve on it.
Very nice. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Would you like to add?
No, just a thank you. It's a really good question.